McKay did, and they said, all right, well, let's make a ventilator that has the capability of doing helium. The software was the easiest part to overcome. I mean, all the engineer had to do was plug in the density of the Heox mixture versus the nitrogen mixture, and that would fix the disparity on the volume. And if we used the 80-20 mix of Heox, it wouldn't have to do anything to the FiO2, and everything was good. Those were the two basic things that they had to do with from a software standpoint. The hardest part really was to figure out how to accomplish the hardware part of it. Okay, so the hardware, I mean, we have the Heox tank over there. We have, and to be official about this with all the official DISS and all those things that we learned in school, we have to have an official Heox regulator that's calibrated for Heox, and not only calibrated for Heox, but it had to be specific to the blend. So that regulator fitting that goes on the tank is different than the one that you would find in a card shop where they fill balloons with 100% helium. That's a different fitting than what's on there, so you have to have the right fitting. Secondly, the output, the DIS, has to be, that hose has to be a DISS diameter coupling that goes on the regulator. And then when it comes into the ventilator, it has to be DISS on the ventilator as well, right? It can't be ARO2. But in the old days, we know that we would get a pair of wrench and, you know, pliers and take the adapters off, and we'd have all sorts of things. And you've probably heard of a lot of horror stories about, yeah, if it was a green hose, yeah, but it was hooked into nitrous, you know, because somebody took the adapter off and plugged it into nitrous, but they thought it was oxygen and it was really nitrous. So they had to come up with a way to do the mechanical part. So the mechanical part is what you guys have to do. The ventilator takes care of everything else. So let me find my air hose here. Okay. So normally the ventilator looks like this with the air hose here and the O2 hose here. Okay? So if we want to use Heox, we have to get our 80-20 tank, we have to get our hose, and our hose, our Heox hose, is connected to this doohickey, but it's really a regulator. It's a preset regulator that regulates the pressure that's coming out. Even though there might be a regulator there, it has to regulate it to 40 psi. Normally, the ventilator can handle 29 psi to 94 psi coming in the air and O2, but it has to be a precise 40. So that's why this is here. This is a check valve, so that even though this tank is on, there's no helium coming out because it's a check valve, but it's a quick connect. So what we had to do also is, rather than have the DIS connector on the air, we had to change this to a quick connect nipple. Okay. So normally we have an air hose, and the air hose now has the same quick connect on it with a check valve. So imagine pressure here, and there's no pressure coming out. So normally the way we have the ventilator set up is like this. Okay. So when you want to do Heox, you get your tank, hook your other end up to the regulator, which is always in here. So this regulator is attached to this little holder here. So you get your Heox hose, put it on there, and turn your regulator on. So now you say, okay, we're going to switch over to Heox. All you have to do is reach up here, disconnect, pull the collar down, and you disconnect the quick connect, and now you're on helium. That's all you have to do. It's just switch like that. So that's the only mechanical thing that you have to do. The ventilator now will do everything else automatically. So what I mean by that is, right now, because the ventilator thinks it's on an O2 air mixture, you know, the volume is what it is, but the volume is now off, right? Because, well, no, the volume is correct because it is an O2 air mixture, but it just happens to be at 100%. So, but now let me get back to reality. So if I turn this back to 100 or to 40%, So let's say I just switched it. I'm at 40%. Can you hear the difference in the ventilator when I did that? What's happening now is the ventilator is going, what's going on? It doesn't seem, there's 440 and 406, so I have a difference here. The ventilator's thinking, what's going on? I see a different density gas, and the only different density gas that it knows is that Heox stuff. So after a few breaths, the ventilator is thinking and saying, I must be using that Heox stuff. So after a couple of breaths, you get this message up here that says, system compensated for HeO2. Your alarm limits have been adjusted. Check your ventilator settings. And I'll explain that in just a minute. So right now, the ventilator has recognized that it's on Heox, and all I do is say, okay, and you'll notice that little tile up there, it says HeO2. So now the ventilator's on Heox, it's using the proper algorithm to measure the Heox, so my volumes are pretty close to being the same. I didn't have to worry about my FiO2 because I'm still using the same blend, right? The same proportion. And if I go and look at my settings, you will notice that the trigger has, if it was at 5, has automatically changed to 1. Okay, this is the ventilator setting that you have to, that is changed automatically for you. Because Heox, because it's a lower density gas, there's a greater propensity for the ventilator to auto cycle. So when it switches over to helium, it'll change the trigger to a less sensitive setting. And if it's in flow trigger, it'll go to 1, but if it's in a negative pressure trigger, it'll stay where it's at. The other thing that it does is the alarm setting, it doesn't change these alarms, but what it does is, you know what the alarm settings are for your oxygen alarm? You know, there's an oxygen alarm that's in the ventilator, but it's automatically set. Do you know how it works? Well, if you look here, this is your FiO2. And next to your FiO2, you see the teeny little numbers there. Those are your alarm values for your FiO2. So when you're in normal, air and nitrogen, when you set it at 40%, your alarms will be 45 and 35, 5 above and 5 below. Then if you say, well, I need to put them on 60%, when you change it to 60, the alarm limits change to 65 and 55. So the O2 alarms are automatically set to be 5% above and 5% below whatever you set this at. That's always been that way. You don't have any control over that. Right? Sometimes it's frustrating because if the O2 sensor or cell went out or it's drifting a lot, you go, God, it's alarming because it's reading, let's say you've got it set at 40%, but it's reading 49% because it drifted. It's going to say high O2 alarm, and you can't silence. I mean, you can silence it for 2 minutes, but you got to keep silencing it every 2 minutes until you replace the O2 cell. So if you had control over the limits, you could set the upper limit at 52% and low, so it wouldn't alarm anymore, right? But you can't do that. So with Heox, the alarm parameters are 7% above and 7% below because there's a little bit more drift associated with the FiO2. So if we were at 40% now, the FiO, the high is 47 and the low is 33, okay? Because you can have a little bit more drift. So the FiO2 alarm has changed and the trigger has changed when we flip over to helium, okay? And that's it, and then this tile is in there. So now if the doctor says, well, I want a 70-30 blend because his PaO2 is good, it's 110. So, okay, well, if I set him at 30%, now you can say, well, okay, he's got a 70-30 blend now. Or you can set a 3168 or whatever blend, or whatever blend you want. You can set a 50-50 blend by just adjusting this. So gone is when people realize that the gas mix of that Heox is the same as the gas mix of nitrogen, and they go, you mean to tell me all I need to do is set it at 25% and the balance is set? Well, how easy is that? That is so easy. But up until that realization, people are going, oh God, do I have to get a 60-40 tank or a 70-30, or how do I do that with an 80-20 tank? And they just forget that helium is simply the carrier gas that you're replacing with the nitrogen, but the proportion of the gases are the same. And that's all there is to Heox. So then, when you say, okay, he's better, we doesn't need the Heox anymore, you simply do in reverse, disconnect your helium, connect your air, and because we don't have any air, we'll pretend for a minute. Okay, so what'll happen, and it'll take longer because it's on 100%, so it's not seeing any of the real change. But what'll happen is after a few breaths, it'll say air mixture detected. Check your tank level, or check your Heox tank, and it switches back. This goes away, and it tells you that you're now compensated for air, not Heox anymore. And you just say okay, and now you're on O2 and air. That's all there is to it.